On a Tuesday morning in September of 1992, Frank Donnelly stood at the edge of a swamp and watched his career sink into the mud. 3 days earlier, his company's newest piece of equipment, a Caterpillar 375 excavator, $600,000 of hydraulic power and computerized precision, had broken through what the surveyors promised was solid ground. The machine had dropped like a stone, its 60-ton weight punching through the thin crust of dried earth into the bottomless black muck beneath. Now the excavator sat in the swamp like a wounded dinosaur, buried to its cab, its yellow paint streaked with mud, its tracks completely invisible beneath the surface. Every hour, it seemed to sink another inch. Frank had tried everything. On the first day, he'd brought in 2 Caterpillar D8 bulldozers and chained them to the stuck machine. The bulldozers had pulled until their own tracks started to slip, until the chains groaned and one of them snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The excavator hadn't moved an inch. On the second day, he'd called in a recovery company from Des Moines, specialists in heavy equipment extraction. They'd brought a truck with a 50-ton winch and anchored it to a concrete foundation half a mile away. The winch had screamed, the cable had stretched, and the anchor had ripped out of the ground. The excavator had sunk another 6 inches. On the third day, Frank had rented a crane. The crane operator had taken one look at the swamp, shaken his head, and refused to get within 100 feet of the edge. "That ground won't hold me," he'd said. "You want 2 machines stuck instead of 1? Now Frank stood with his engineers, looking at a piece of equipment worth more than most houses, slowly disappearing into the earth. "What about a helicopter?" one of the engineers suggested. "A sky crane could lift it." "A sky crane costs $15,000 an hour," Frank said, "and the nearest one is in Minnesota. By the time it gets here, that excavator will be underground. We could drain the swamp." "With what? That swamp is fed by an underground spring. We'd need a month and $1 million. Insurance?" Frank laughed bitterly. "Insurance doesn't cover operator error. And according to the fine print, driving into a swamp counts as operator error." The engineers fell silent. They were running out of options, and they knew it. That's when the John Deere tractor pulled up to the edge of the construction site. Let me tell you about Walter Brennan, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Walter was 73 years old and had farmed the same 400 acres in Clayton County for 50 years. His land bordered the construction site, or what would become Highway 52 when Donnelly Construction finished the job. Walter had watched the construction crews arrive 6 months ago, watched them survey and grade and pour concrete, watched them bring in equipment that cost more than his entire farm was worth. He hadn't complained when the noise scared his cattle. He hadn't complained when the construction traffic tore up the county road. He hadn't even complained when the project manager told him he'd need to relocate his fence line because the original survey had been wrong. Walter Brennan wasn't a complainer. He was a watcher. And he'd been watching this stuck excavator for 3 days, waiting to see if the construction company would figure it out. They hadn't. So Walter drove his John Deere to the edge of the site, climbed down, and walked over to where Frank Donnelly stood with his engineers. "Morning," Walter said. Frank barely glanced at him. "Morning. Site's closed to visitors. Insurance liability." "I'm not a visitor. I'm your neighbor. Own the land on the other side of that tree line." Walter nodded toward the stuck excavator. "Saw your problem. Thought I might be able to help." Now Frank looked at him, looked at the worn overalls, the mud-caked boots, the 73-year-old face weathered by half a century of Iowa weather. "Help how? I can pull that out." The words hung in the air. The engineers exchanged glances. Someone coughed. Frank Donnelly started to laugh. Let me tell you about that laugh, because it's important to the story. Frank Donnelly was 45 years old and had built Donnelly Construction from nothing. He'd started with one backhoe and a pickup truck, worked 18-hour days for 20 years, and turned himself into the biggest contractor in eastern Iowa. He employed 150 men. He had equipment worth millions. He'd built bridges and highways and shopping centers and schools. Frank Donnelly was not a humble man. Success had taught him that he was smarter than most people, harder working than most people, better than most people. When he looked at Walter Brennan, at the old farmer in his worn clothes with his ancient tractor,